Look! Look, the dynamic duo! I got
Welcome to the Dynamic Duo. I'm Franz.
I'm Kevin. Welcome to the new Batcave and Avengers Tower, everybody. We've missed you.
Yeah, it's been a while since we've done a show, but I wanted to talk to you, Kevin, about this topic that came out recently, the Ray Fisher article. And I really wanted to get your feedback on it. I know you had the opportunity to read the article. So what I wanted to do is, before we get the feedback, is basically kind of read some of the highlights of the article, if you don't mind. And I want to get your feedback from
Go for it.
that. All right, so as you guys know, there's been controversy. Ray Fisher has made accusations against Joss Whedon, against Geoff Johns, and against basically WB in general, Walter Hamada. And it's been going back and forth. There was confusion as to whether or not he was cooperating with the investigations, who was at fault, who's telling the truth. And so finally, Ray Fisher and the Hollywood Reporter did an interview. And he did an interview where he basically spilled the beans. He basically named names. And so this is the article that came out. And I recommend you guys go to online and go to the Hollywood Reporter to read it for yourself. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to read some of the highlighted points so that Kevin and I could discuss it and you guys could give us some feedback. So it says, for Fisher, who plays Cyborg in the film, the issue is no longer so much what happened on the set of 2017 after director Zack Snyder was replaced by Joss Whedon, though he's ready to explain that too. His unrelenting focus in recent months has been the way executives, first at the Warner Film Studio and then at his parent, Warner Media, handled allegations raised by himself and others. Catherine Forrest, a former federal judge who conducted the Warner Media probe, tells the Hollywood Reporter in a statement that in interviews with more than 80 witnesses, she found no credible support for claims of racial animus or racial insensitivity. A Warner Media spokesman notes that the company, quote, made extraordinary effort to accommodate Mr. Fisher's concerns about the investigation and to ensure its fullness and fairness, unquote, and has, quote, complete confidence in the investigation process and Forrest's conclusion, end quote. While Fisher has dropped details and named names, outsiders have struggled to understand, how did Whedon incur his anger? Did Fisher really decline to participate in an investigation that was launched in response to his own complaints, as Warner claimed in September? Was Fisher fighting a righteous battle or a quixotic one where he set out on a path that appears to have cost him a place in the DC film universe? Fisher got Warner to start an investigation more than 2 years after the first version of the film was released, but he soon found the process to be suspicious. The studio and his parent company seemed to be focused on protecting top executives, he says. The process moved in starts and stops, and when he felt forced to ramp up his public protest, the studio responded with what Fisher calls a deliberate smear. Warner's maintains it has done everything necessary to address Fisher's concern. He still wants an apology. And May 20, sources say Snyder was under enormous pressure at the time. The studio, unhappy with the reception and box office performance of his previous film, the bleak Batman and Superman, Batman versus Superman, and with Justice League footage already shot, now insisted on a lighter touch. Warner's also asked Snyder to produce a 2-hour cut that he had a wrenching time delivering, though eventually did. Ultimately, Snyder left, and Whedon, who had written and directed Marvel's Avengers and had already been brought in to help brighten Justice League's tone, took the helm. The Justice League that Fisher had signed up for was a far cry from the film that Whedon ended up finishing. Snyder had Fisher talk at length with screenwriter Chris Terrio before there was even a script. Zach and I always considered Cyborg's story to be the heart of the movie, Terrio tells the Hollywood Reporter. He has the most pronounced character arc of any of the heroes, beginning from a place of despair and ending with a feeling that, quote, he is whole, and that he is loved, unquote. And Terrio says he and Snyder took the portrayal of the first Black superhero in the DC film universe, quote, very seriously, adding, with a white writer and a white director, we both thought having the perspective of an actor of color was really important. And Ray is really good at story and character, so he became a partner in creating Victor, unquote, referring to the character's given name. When new filming proceeded under Whedon, says Fisher, he came to feel that he had to explain some of the most basic points of what would be offensive to the Black community. After Fisher's reps were told that Whedon planned to make major revisions to the films, he flew to New Jersey to meet with the filmmaker in LA. When the two met at a bar, Fisher says Whedon was, quote, tiptoeing around the fact that everything was changing, unquote. As he left the meeting, Fisher was handed the revised script, which he read twice on the plane back. Gone was Cyborg's traumatic backstory, his relationship with his mother, whose loving scenes with her son were eliminated, as was the accident that killed her and led to his transformation. Quote, it represents that his parents are two genius-level Black people, Fisher says. We don't see that every day. Whedon sent out an email asking for questions, comments, or, quote, fulsome praise, unquote. But Fisher says it became clear all he was looking for was fulsome praise. Trying to strike a jocular tone, Fisher responded that he mourned the loss of the Cyborg material, but was moving on. He said he had notes to avoid issues in terms of representation of the character. But in a call with Whedon, Fisher says he had barely started to talk when the filmmaker cut him off. It feels like I'm taking notes right now, and I don't like taking notes from anybody, not even Robert Downey Jr., he said. Other sources on the project say Whedon was similarly dismissive of Godot and Momoa when they questioned new lines. Whedon declined to comment for this piece. Fisher turned to Johns, who he says has presented himself as a kind of mediator. But Fisher says his ultimate response was, quote, we can't make Joss mad. Publicist Howard Bragman, who represents John, denies that, but John recalls suggesting that any creative pitches should happen when Joss Whedon was not preoccupied, so he would be more receptive. Once Whedon got involved, Fisher says that Johns told him that it was problematic that Cyborg smiled only twice in the movie. Fisher says he later learned that from a witness who participated in the investigation that Johns and other top executives, including then DC Film co-chairman John Berg and Warner Brothers studio chief Toby Emmerich, had discussions in which they said they could not have a quote unquote angry Black man at the center of the film. Johns' rep responds that once the chairman of the studio mandated a brighter tone for the film, all further discussions centered on adding joy and hopefulness to all 6 superheroes. There are always conversations about avoiding any stereotype of race, gender, or sexuality. Johns told Fisher he should play the character less like Frankenstein and more like the kind-hearted Quasimodo. Fisher says that in order to demonstrate the look he wanted, Johns dipped his shoulder in what struck Fisher as a servile posture. To Fisher, there was a big difference between portraying a character who was born with a disability versus one who had been transformed by trauma. And he felt Cyborg was a kind of modern-day Frankenstein. I didn't have any intention of playing him as a jovial, cathedral-cleaning individual, he says. John's representative's response: Jeff gave a note using a fictional character as an example of a sympathetic man who is unhappy and has an inclination to hide from the world, but one whom the audience roots for because he has a courageous heart, unquote. Fisher told Johns it might be one thing for a non-Black person to write a character for a comic, but it was another for a Black actor to portray that character on screen. It was like he was assuming how Black people would respond rather than taking the advice from the only Black person, as far as I know, with any kind of creative impact on the project, Fisher says. Fisher says Johns did not yield. That was the last creative conversation about anything that Jeff Johns and I had. I knew I was on my own, Fisher says. Johns' rep denies that he ever dismissed any comments, adding that Fisher knew Johns, whose spokesperson requested that he be identified as Lebanese American. Justice League was a $300 million proposition, and it was troubled. Warner's had not been able to match Disney's consistent success with Marvel movies. Fisher felt that some of the studio's executives' decision-making was driven by fear of losing their jobs. The tension only escalated when the issue of having Cyborg say "Booyah" arose. That phrase had become a signature of the character thanks to the animated Teen Titans show, but the character had never said it in the comics or in the original script. Fisher says that Johns had approached Snyder about including the line, but the director didn't want any catchphrases. He managed the situation by putting the word on some signs in his version of the film as an Easter egg. But Johns' rep said the entire studio believed that that the Booyah line was a, quote, fun moment of synergy. Fisher says he doesn't see the word in itself as an issue, but he thought it played differently in a live action film than in animated characters and with defining phrases. Gary Coleman's "What you doing? What you talking about, Willis?" Jimmy Walker's "Dynamite," and no one else in the film had a catchphrase, he says. It seemed weird to have the only Black character say that. With reshoots underway, Fisher says Whedon raised the issue again. Jeff tells me Cyborg has a catchphrase, he told him. Fisher says he expressed his objection and it seemed the matter was dropped until Berg, the co-chairman of DC Films and a producer on the project, took him to dinner. This is one of the most expensive movies Warner's has ever made, Berg said, according to Fisher. What if the CEO of AT&T has a son or daughter, and that son or daughter wants Cyborg to say "Booyah" in the movie, and we don't have that? We don't have a take of that. I could lose my job. Fisher responded that he knew if he filmed the line, it would end up in the movie, and he expressed skepticism that the film's fate rested on Cyborg saying "Booyah." But he shot the take. As he arrived on set, he says, Whedon stretched out his arm and said a line from Hamlet in a mocking tone. "Speak the speech, I pray you, as I pronounced it to you," Fisher replied. "Just don't, I'm not in the mood." As he left the set after saying just that one phrase for the cameras, he says Whedon called out, "Nice work, Ray." Even before that line was shot, Fisher's agent had called Warner Brothers studio chief Emmerich to raise concern about what was happening on set. After Fisher arrived in Los Angeles for additional photography in summer of 2017, Johns asked him to come to DC office in Burbank. When they met in a conference room, Fisher said he had apologized to Whedon for his part in the conflict, which he had done in the hope of preventing a real rupture with the DC team. Johns responded that having agents call Emmerich was, quote, just not cool. Fisher recalls, he said, "I consider us to be friends," which he knew we were not, "and I just don't want you to make a bad name for yourself in the business." Fisher took that as a threat. Johns' rep says he never made a threat, but told Fisher that creative differences were not normally taken to the head of a film studio by an actor's agent. Fisher was not the only Justice League star who was unhappy. Sources say that Whedon clashed with stars of the film, including Jeremy Irons, and one Justice League star ended up taking her complaints not only to the head of the film studio, but also to the chairman of Warner Brothers. A knowledgeable source says Gadot had multiple concerns with the revised version of the film, including issues about her character being more aggressive than her character in Wonder Woman. She wanted to make the character flow from one movie to the next. So, and I'm going to stop here and I'm not going to read the whole article, and we could reference the article as we talk about it. Again, I definitely recommend everyone go online to the Hollywood Reporter to read the full article. But given what I've read so far, what's your take, Kevin?
This is a very, very complex issue because, in my opinion, there is a lot more involved in this than Ray Fisher versus Joss Whedon. And one of the things that I do agree with concerning the article is the whole catchphrase thing. I get that completely, okay? But at the same time, based on what had been said, and maybe this was the reason why they didn't originally want to include it, is that with the exception of maybe a catchphrase coming from Batman to Alfred or vice versa, a lot of these characters, the catchphrases came from some of the cartoons back in the 70s. Okay. And what I mean by that is Superman doesn't say up, and away anymore. You know, that came from the radio days of the character because it was their way of describing the fact that he was getting ready to go flying. That kind of thing. You know, Batman, you know, doesn't do the, you know, the old fashioned thing of to the bat poles, Robin, we've got to go. It's not part of the character anymore. And in truth, the only one, and I, with the exception of Wonder Woman saying, Hera, give me strength from the Justice League cartoons, I do not remember Wonder Woman ever having a catchphrase. And I don't think the Flash ever did either. So it's kind of bizarre in the sense I get the whole catchphrase thing. It works in Cyborg's case, I think, because he's a teenager or a young adult. I get it in that sense. Story-wise, on the same side, it almost doesn't fit because the others aren't doing it. Part of what I've always wondered about this whole breakdown, and forgive me for jumping around with this, but part of what has caused me to kind of say, okay, what exactly is going on in the head and the heart of Joss Whedon as a creative person, and what I mean by that is, of course, he's had charges brought up on him from people from Buffy the Vampire Slayer and on down the line. But I would actually love to know, did any of this happen when he was in charge of the Avengers? Because from what I understand, it's either a matter of A, no, there wasn't, or all the folks that were part of the Avengers aren't going to speak up and say, yeah, it happened here, unless they somehow become affected by it through all the back and forth that's going on now. I don't necessarily know if the right level of emphasis is being put on the fact that Cyborg is, you know, one of the only Black characters within the space of the DC universe and all that kind of thing. It's because some of that I think is being, and I need our audience to forgive us or forgive me in advance. I think some of that is being over exaggerated or overemphasized. Because it's from my point of view, okay, you create a Black character and then you go into, and this is with anything, and then you go into, you know, well, it's a Black character and a Black actor and a Black scenario and what have you, and a white writer doesn't know, or a white creator doesn't know what to do about this. It's part of what's going on in Hollywood right now, to me, is a very dangerous thing to begin with, because and it's far more dangerous than what we're hearing about these DC Comics issues or anything else for that matter. And that is, oh, if you're going to have a project that'll have a Black person involved, then a Black writer or someone along that line needs to be on set. I don't necessarily agree with that. Part of why I don't is because on the whole, we've had white creators, white writers, and what have you, that have absolutely nailed what has been in front of them. Case in point, and it's a very hot topic right now, but case in point is the original Coming to America. the original Coming to America, even though Eddie Murphy was one of the executive producers and the writer, the original movie was directed by John Landis. John Landis is the same man who did the Blues Brothers, Animal House, and what have you. And the original Coming to America is a modern day comedy, romantic comedy classic, as opposed to, and I hate to say this, Eddie, so you can shoot me later, as opposed to the 30-year follow-up of Coming to America 2, where the majority of the people involved are Black and the movie is absolute trash. So, and to me, it just depends upon what you're really going for and who's doing it.
I appreciate you, and I appreciate the way you think, and I think we have so many things in common. You're absolutely right. This is a complex issue. And as a Black man, I'm very sensitive to a couple of things. I'm sensitive to racism. I'm sensitive to oppression. I'm sensitive to any time racism rears its ugly head, whether it's in movies or in books or in any medium, or in jobs or in reality or in life. But at the same time, while I'm very sensitive to that, it doesn't mean that I'm automatically going to agree that everything is racist that I see, or any action and every action is racist. I have to look at each individual case on its own merit to make my decision. And one of the second thing that I'm very keen on is using the race card inappropriately. I think we have to be careful with that. And lastly, the thing that you said is sometimes imposing the race card in a way that's not necessary. Forcing a Black writer to write a Black character is always better if everything is equal, if the Black writer is as good as the white writer. But I'd rather a very good white writer to write a Black character than a bad Black writer to write a Black character, because ultimately the material is what's important. I have to tell you, I don't like this situation. Initially, I never quite jived with the Ray Fisher point of view. I never quite understood it. And I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt, and I wanted to hear, and I was humbled to know that I didn't know what was going on. And Ray Fisher was very cryptic initially. He didn't name names and he didn't quite say what was going on. But what I had heard wasn't enough for me to say, oh my God, Ray, I hear your point of view. We talked about that in previous shows. In reading this article, I have to say, I'm still not quite there for Ray Fisher. I still don't quite get it. So clearly, and so there are two issues here. One is the Ray Fisher situation, and then the other thing is the Warner Brothers Justice League situation. And they both, connect with one another. With respect to Ray Fisher, clearly the character Cyborg, the story arc that was in the Zack Snyder version was not in the Joss Whedon version. Clearly, his character was diminished. His role was diminished substantially. Clearly, the movie went from a 4-hour, perhaps two and a half, 3-hour movie to a 2-hour movie. And so I could understand why, as an actor, he was dissatisfied with that. But there's a big difference between dissatisfaction and accusations of inappropriateness. Okay? You're an actor, you're paid to do the job. Sometimes actors do the whole role and literally none of it is shown on the screen. Like it's cut out absolutely and completely. That's just the way the thing falls. And so Ray Fisher now is unhappy because he feels that Cyborg's story was diminished. Well, that's just the way the cookie crumbles. I hate to be that cold about it, but anytime you take a material that's 3 hours plus long and you reduce it to 2 hours, something is going to be lost, okay? So that's the way the cookie crumbles. And so now he is unhappy and he goes and he talks to Joss Whedon about it. Now, part of the rest of the article talks about Ray Fisher, and maybe I'll read that part, but Ray Fisher, what he does in the investigation that he demands that Warner Brother investigate. And he wanted to have Josh Whedon investigated, Jeff Johns investigated, Walter Hamada investigated. He essentially wanted to have the whole DC Warner Brothers media put under trial for what happened. So the question becomes, what happened? Oh my God, like what did Josh Whedon do? What did Jeff Johns do? Because certainly if Jeff Johns and Josh Whedon did something wrong, I agree it should be pursued to the fullest and investigated and released, and perhaps, heads should roll. So I'm waiting to hear what this evil action that Josh Whedon did. And I don't hear anything. He had a conversation with Josh Whedon where Josh Whedon cut him off. That's not a reason to be investigating thing. I'm sorry, Kevin. I don't know if you agree, but I don't think that's a reason for you to go home and be angry. It's a reason for you to tell your wife how horrible your boss is. It's not a reason to demand an investigation. And when Jeff Johns sat down with him and he's telling the story about Jeff Johns sitting down with him, again, I don't see what Jeff Johns did that's so offensive to him. I really don't. For him to now demand that not only Josh Whedon be investigated, but Jeff Johns be investigated. And later on in the article, he talks about Walter Hamada, talking to Walter Hamada, and then Walter Hamada fires Josh Whedon, fires him. So what more do you want? I don't understand. Warner Media set out an investigation that they did, they conducted, they interviewed 80 plus people. What more I don't know what more it is that he's looking for. And yes, it is true that the investigation turned out that there was nothing, there's no real impropriety, but at the same time, heads roll. Josh Whedon is no longer part of Warner Media. And so that conversation with Walter Hamada, he wants Walter Hamada to be investigated because he feels Walter Hamada threw, quote unquote, Josh Whedon under the bus by saying he's an asshole or something along those lines. And I just don't get it. I don't get, and I'm not siding with Ray Fisher on this issue. And I'm making a distinction between an abusive boss and a mean boss. Someone who does something wrong should be investigated. But someone who is just unpleasant or not nice or kind of mean, you may be angry, you may be frustrated. We've all had, stupid bosses, but to demand investigations and to demand that heads roll, I think takes it too far. One last thing that I'm going to say, and this is going to sound weird because it's going to sound like I'm defending the Warner Brothers side. And I promise you, I'm trying to be as objective as possible. But we have to remember that this didn't come out of nowhere. This didn't come out of nowhere. Wanting a Cyborg to say booyah didn't come out of nowhere. And it certainly didn't come out of racism, in my opinion. It's not like, oh, we're racist, let's make the Black character do a Django dance. I don't think that's what's happening. Let's be fair. First of all, the phrase booyah was a known catchphrase for the character Cyborg. And unlike Up and Away, which was in the 50s and the 60s, it wasn't even no longer in vogue by the 80s. The booyah was fairly recent, and it's connected in the minds of a lot of young people who grew up watching the animated Teen Titans series. Second of all, the fact that you're saying booyah doesn't mean you have to be clownish in the way that you said it. And I'm sure that however the delivery would have been, it could have been done in a cool way, in a way that we could have owned and said, yeah, that's right, booyah, So the phrase itself is not problematic and it's not racist, and it certainly doesn't come from nowhere. There's a direct correlation. Now, why do we want him to say booyah? The article says that Jeff Johns and Warner Brothers wanted to inject a lighter tone onto the Justice League. Well, that didn't come from nowhere either. That didn't come from nowhere either. We have to remember that the fans were going crazy against Warner Brothers. We have to remember, I do. You know, we tend to say, oh, everybody loves Zack Snyder now, okay? Zack Snyder is the man. But I remember the time when Zack Snyder was public enemy #1, and everybody hated Zack Snyder because he was too dark and DC movies sucked. There are videos upon videos upon videos that explain why DC sucks, why DC movies sucks, as opposed to Marvel movies, right? So, and the primary reason, which I never agreed with, but the primary reason was that DC movies were dark and they weren't as light as Marvel movies. So for the studio to want to inject a lighter tone upon a Zack Snyder film makes sense. I don't agree with it. I don't think it's right, but it makes sense for them to think that way because that's what the fans were demanding. That's what the fans were demanding. And you know, the fans trash Zack Snyder. They trash Batman versus Superman. And they were trashing Justice League before the movie came out. They were trashing it before it came out. So no wonder the studio was concerned. And no wonder they wanted to go to a different direction. And no wonder they were kind of glad that, hey, you know what? Joss Whedon, who at the time was considered, you know, God's gift because he was Marvel and he was Avengers. Let's bring some of that Marvel magic upon DC. I can't fault them for whether I agree or disagree is not the point. The point is I can't fault them for thinking that way. So I have to conclude that I don't agree with, I don't appreciate Ray Fisher's point of view. I think it's too much. And I think that him dropping the race card is inappropriate and therefore a bad thing to do because it hurts our cause when you do that inappropriately. I think it's fair to say that Geoff Johns should be given credit. Listen, I don't know Geoff Johns to save my life. I'm not a fan of Geoff Johns by any stretch of the imaginations. He's not in my radar in any way, shape, or form. But the man did write Cyborg. He knows the character. He knows the material, and whether or not I agree with his vision or not, he has a right to have a vision for the character, for the movies that he's producing. He has that right. And if that right does not create a racist point of view, then whether I like it or not, that's his prerogative. That's my say on it.
I thank you for that. And I know you said you don't want to have this drone on for too long, but you said some wonderful things that I have to piggyback on. I have to. One, you know, you mentioned, you know, somebody having bad behavior or, you know, just not being a pleasant person. Two of the biggest people in the history of Hollywood, Otto Preminger and David O. Selznick, put together some of the best material that Hollywood has ever seen. But it had always been talked about that, pardon my French, because I don't speak Spanish, that both men were absolute bastards on their sets. Both of them. But they got their work done. They got their films made. And I do believe in part that maybe because of the way that actors for now are perceiving a lot of this stuff, because they expect everybody to step on stage and be like, hey gang, we're gonna make a movie and we're gonna do this, and not everybody is like that.
Yeah.
And that makes it, not saying that you can't be kind to people, not saying that you can't open yourself to ideas and thoughts and say, okay, this scene doesn't work this way, but can we rework it another way? Not everyone on a creative level is going to allow you to do that. Okay? Not every friend that you even have in real life, when you're having conversations with people, you're not going to be able to break through to everybody you talk to say, okay, here's point of view number one, and here's point of view number two. It's just part of reality.
Yes.
The other big thing that I think, and this is just my thought, so to quote you with respect to Mr. Fisher, I think part of the problem with this is that with a lot of these pre-existing characters, whether they're coming from a comic book or a cartoon or whatever the case may be, a series of novels that have been written by somebody else that are absolutely famous in terms of literary circles, a lot of actors, of course, and it makes sense, take these roles and they think, okay, once I do this, I'm going to become the next household name. I'm going to become the next thing that everybody is going to be talking about. I'm going to make millions upon millions upon millions of dollars. And with the exception of certain pieces that I can pick and choose, I will never have to work again. And I think a lot of this is honestly ego run amok.
Yeah.
Okay. Because let's be honest for 2 seconds. It's not that Fisher is not a talented actor. That's been proven through what Snyder's 4-hour cut has shown us. But when you get right down to it, this is, as far as I know, this is the only major studio piece he's ever done. Okay? He hasn't proven himself in Hollywood enough for a lot of what we have gotten over the years from, say, a Michael B. Jordan or a Sidney Poitier or a Denzel Washington. He hasn't been around long enough for that.
Sure.
And even when you get right down to his supporting players, to take nothing away from Ezra Miller or Jason Momoa, Momoa was involved in Game of Thrones. But outside of Game of Thrones, and I think Momoa was in that he was the lead in the reworked version of Conan from a couple of years ago.
He was.
That movie did not go anywhere, didn't really do anything for his career. It
Okay.
wasn't that it was a absolutely terrible movie, it just didn't move. Okay. They did some things with the Conan character that didn't work, but it's not like outside of Aquaman that Momoa is even a household name. Even if you look at Gal Gadot, as
That's
popular
right.
as Gal is,
That's right.
what is she known for?
That's right.
Wonder Woman. She's done a couple of other movies. She's in the middle of making, I think, or has something to do with an upcoming biopic about the history of the women's suffragette movement. I believe so. I could be wrong about that, but I know she's got something major going on right now outside of trying to figure out whether or not they're going to make Wonder Woman 3 or when they're going to get started or whatever the case may be. But just because you are part of these things as an actor or even as a director or writer or creative person, that doesn't mean that you've hit pay dirt and it's going to work for you. I look back at, if I may, for 30 more seconds, the careers of Lucas and Spielberg. These are two incredibly popular people. They reworked Hollywood in the 70s. If it was, in my opinion, if it wasn't for the two of them, you wouldn't have the Hollywood that you have now, because that helped springboard not only themselves into what they were doing, but it got you the John Carpenters. It brought out the Brian De Palmas and other people along that line that were all part of that whole setup. Even Francis Ford Coppola, in his own right, even well beyond the Godfather. But when you look at what Hollywood is saying about them now, as big as Spielberg is, studios and Hollywood in general, they either want Indiana Jones from him or they want E.T. They want Close Encounters.
Yeah.
Guess what, folks? He's done that. It's the same thing with George Lucas. They look at Lucas and they either want Star Wars or they want American Graffiti.
Yeah.
If he tries anything else, they look at him, well, damn, he's crazy. He doesn't know what he's doing. What's wrong with Lucas? He's out of his mind. So in a lot of ways, you get pigeonholed into these situations where even if you're successful, you can't break out of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Again, I love our conversations because again, you're exactly on point, and you yourself have said a lot of very, very important things. You know, starting with that whole, you know, looking at certain directors that are known to be jerks, that are known to be really horrible. I thought you were going to go with Alfred Hitchcock and people like that.
Oh my God, yes.
I remember when the movie Blue came out, and the actress was like, you don't understand this director. And she had a legitimate case. She was like, you don't understand, this director tortured me, like literally tortured me. So this isn't to excuse bad behavior. We're not supporting bad behavior. And certainly if a director tortures or is rudely inappropriate with an actor, it should be a point of concern. But there has to be that line between inappropriate, illegal behavior to tough and mean behavior. And so when you are demanding investigations, because it's one thing to, like Gal Gadot. Gal Gadot didn't like apparently didn't like the interaction with Joss Whedon. She talked to the head about it, and she was like, look, I didn't like that. And that's it. So Gal Gadot, what do you think about Joss Whedon? Oh, he's great. That's it. She left it at that. Whereas Fisher is demanding investigation upon investigation. And when you do that, you have to have just cause. And what is the just cause? Reveal it to me in this article. And you're telling me he had a conversation with you. That's the extent to which, that's the only negative thing that I saw, that he cut him off and said, I don't want to like to take notes, even from Robert Downey Jr. Dude, you got to come with more than that. And this isn't to defend Joss Whedon. We may find out that Joss Whedon is a rapist, that he beat up people on the set of Buffy, and that he stabbed someone on the set of I don't know that. I don't know Joss Whedon. I don't know how good or bad he is. But let's look at the situation with the Justice League with respect to Joss Whedon. The fact of the matter is that he had pressure on him to deliver a product in a very short amount of time. There was stress there, and he needed to be a tyrant to get the job done, because the pressure was coming from the studios, the pressure was coming from everybody, the pressure. We need to take this 4-hour extravaganza and we need to reduce it to 2 hours, and we need to make it light. Those were dictates that were being told to him. So while I'm not saying that excuses inappropriate, illegal behavior, it certainly makes me understand if he was not exactly the nicest person. As you said, you know, he didn't sit down to get your point of view too long. It explained, I understand that. And here's the problem that I find, Kevin. Ray Fisher's behavior has a lot of significant consequences. In reading the article and researching this stuff even more, what I'm realizing is that the whole Snyderverse, the reason why Warner Brothers is not moving forward with the Snyderverse, despite the fact that it would be the biggest cash cow they could possibly have, is because of Ray Fisher. It's Ray Fisher and Zack Snyder, Ray Fisher because of Zack Snyder, that connection. First of all, the fans were against Zack Snyder. That's why the Warner Brothers didn't want to move on with him. But now that this thing has turned and Zack Snyder is the golden boy, Warner Brothers would absolutely ride that wave. Why wouldn't they ride that wave? Except for the fact that the Snyderverse includes Cyborg, includes Ray Fisher. And let me ask you a direct question. If you're Walter Hamada, and you sat down with Ray Fisher and you said, Ray, bro, I hear what you're coming from. Josh Whedon, man, he is a jerk. And you know what? He's not going to be there with us anymore. And then you're getting Ray Fisher asking for your head. Do you hire that guy? I'm asking you a direct question. Do you hire that guy?
Honestly, because of what I said a few moments ago, no, it's a studio thing. They want money. They're in the business to make money through movies, television, etc. And if you're impeding that money, then no, you're not going to have a job. And it's that simple.
Yeah, and if you, by the way, if you're impeding my ego too, if you're putting me in trouble, sometimes I don't care how much money I make. You know, you can go to hell. We'll make it another way, you know, because you are asking for my job, dude.
I'm like the music business, Hollywood in general, with the film and television business. The key word there is business. And if you have hurt that business, if you've impeded it, if you damage the image, the ego, whatever word you want to use, your relationship with those people is over. It's finished.
Yes.
And only very rarely will you be able to make a comeback.
Yes. 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 Right now, the way, as I see it, the only way the Zack Snyder verse would move forward is if Cyborg is replaced. That's the only, and otherwise there will not be a Snyderverse. And that puts everybody in a very tough position, because what would Zack Snyder do in this case? Would he accept that? Would he sort of throw Ray Fisher under the bus, and so on and so forth? But that's what Ray Fisher, in my opinion, has created. And if he had created that justly, I would back him and I would sacrifice the Snyderverse. I don't think that he did. I don't think that what he did was justified.
Well,
and therefore,
I'm sorry. I told you they've already cut Cyborg and
from
Fisher away from Flashpoint. He's gone.
Exactly. That's exactly what I mean. That's along the lines of what I mean. He has become the problem. And so they were able to move on with Flash by cutting him out of the movie. But you can't do a Justice League without Cyborg unless you eliminate him in one way or another. Either you kill him off somehow, or you replace the actor, or something. But what you're not going to do is hire Ray Fisher to be in that movie. I'm not doing it. I swear to God. If I'm Jeff Johns, I'm not doing it. If I'm Walter Hamada, I'm not doing it. I'm just not doing it. Because, dude, like, what the hell? You know, there was part of the article where he says that he took Jeff Johns's comment as a threat. And Jeff Johns was like, dude, like, you don't send your agent to file a complaint to the head of the studio. That doesn't help your career. Now, you could look at that as a threat, or you could look at it as a really good advice. Like, really good, like, really friendly advice. This is, if my brother was in that position, I'd pull him aside and be like, listen, let's be careful. Let's understand the risk to your career. Now, let me say this one quick thing is, one thing that I admire in Ray Fisher is that he is willing to sacrifice it all for his integrity. I admire that. And not enough of us are willing to give up fame and fortune. And too many of us are willing to bend over just to have that fame and that fortune. And his integrity says, you know what? No, I'm going to stand up for my rights, even though it may sacrifice all that. I admire that, Ray Fisher, and kudos to you. I just wish your cause was a better cause. I just wish your cause was a better cause. You can't tell me that because you had a conversation with Joss Whedon and he interrupted you, you're up in arms. You can't tell me because you had a conversation with Jeff Johns and he kind of said, hey, let's make Josh, the director, happy. You're up in arms. You can't tell me that you talked to Walter Hamada and because he didn't somehow, what was he supposed to do? Maybe kill Josh Whedon? Like, what was he supposed to do? Dude, I'm sorry.
I love how you did that. Take him out back and shoot him.
Take him out back.
Shoot Whedon. We'll bury the body out back.
Exactly. Exactly. Dude, find a better cause to fall on the sword for. I'm sorry.
This looks like a job for Superman.
Hey, look! It's Spider-Man!
The dynamic duo return next week. Don't listen.